So where is this God? Well, one day, God appeared to a man named Moses. And God says to Moses, "Moses, good news, I've heard the cries of my people, and I'm going to set them free from Egypt." And Moses said, "That's great, but what does that have to do with me?" And God says, "Well, you're the one who's going to lead them." And Moses says, "Well, I can't do that. You see, I don't speak very well." And God says, "I know, that's why I chose you." And then Moses says to God, "I've been to Egypt before, and it really didn't go very well the first time I was there." And God says, "I know, that's why I chose you." And Moses said, "So let me get this straight. You want me to go to the most powerful man in the world, the Pharaoh, and tell him to release all the workers in his nation, all the slaves?" And God says, "Exactly." And Moses said, "That's never going to happen." And God said, "Trust me." And not long after that, all the slaves in Egypt were set free. And they were following Moses. All because God made a promise to Abraham. And it's in that moment that we see the foreshadowing of what God was doing as he was writing the story of redemption, freeing his people from the physical bonds of slavery. And that brings us to the next chapter in our story, the next word, which is law, because suddenly there's a whole nation of people who don't know God. They have no laws. They have no religious beliefs to guide them. All they have is this story about this some God somewhere making a promise to one of their ancestors, Abraham, more than 400 years ago. And now this story that they thought for sure was just a myth, it suddenly seems like it might actually be true, because God tells Moses to bring the people to Mount Sinai, and on Mount Sinai, God says to the people, "Now that I have brought you out of Egypt, now that I have freed you from slavery, now that I have loved you, I want to tell you who I am." And so God gives to them his name. And he gives them his law. And in his law, the people see what God's values are. They see that God values the most. What he values the most is his relationship with us. That he is our God. And secondly, what he values is the relationships that we have with each other. And it's in this part of the story that we discover something amazing, because within the law, God actually makes provision for people who would break the law. In other words, God actually realizes that his law is going to be broken. It was as if God was saying, "Here's my law, I know you're going to break it. Here's my law, I know you're going to screw it up. Here's my law, I know you're not going to be able to keep it." Why? Because you're broken. And I have not yet fixed you. See, the amazing thing was that when a person broke God's law, they had to kill an animal. Now, that wasn't new. People had been doing that almost intuitively for many, many, many years. But in the law, God explained to us that when his law was broken, when there was sin, then something must die. Because a long time ago, when sin entered into our world, God's relationship with humanity, God's relationship with us, died. And our relationships with each other died. And our relationship with creation died. And God wants us to understand that anytime there is sin, something will die. And God said the deaths of these animals, they will not pay for your sin. They will only temporarily cover up your sin. And God says, here's my law, and here's what happens when my law is broken. And that brings us to the next chapter in our story, and the word is rebellion. Because not only did Israel break God's law, they abandoned God's law. And as you're reading through the Old Testament, and you come across all the books that begin with 1st and 2nd, You'll find that first and second, everything in the Old Testament is the history of rebellion. It's the history of God telling Israel to do one thing and them deciding to do another. It's the history of God sending prophets to Israel and Israel ignoring them. And it's because of their rebellion that Israel lived in an almost constant state of war and invasion. Because of their refusal to follow God's commands. Because of their belief that they knew better than God did. Now finally, the nation of Israel was scattered among the other nations. The temple was destroyed, and for all practical purposes, Israel was dead. And again, if you had been born during those years of captivity, you would have been tempted to say, just like many people in our world are tempted to say, why should I believe God? Why should I trust God? Because you could have been born and died in any one of those generations and never heard or seen God. And so could your children, and so could your grandchildren. But God is a God who keeps His promises. And even though God was silent, He was not absent, because He was preparing the story of redemption. Now, the last prophet that spoke to the nation of Israel was a man named Malachi. And between Malachi and the New Testament, there were 400 more years where God said nothing. And again, it was just like today, when people said, maybe there is no God, maybe it was all just a myth or a fairy tale, maybe it was all just made up. Maybe it was all just a bunch of stories that parents told to their children to try to get them to be good. But after 400 years, a new prophet finally appeared to Israel. And his name was John. And this new prophet was so focused on his mission that he quickly earned a nickname, John the Baptizer. And his mission is recorded for us in 1 John, beginning in verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through Him all things were made. Without Him nothing was made that has been made. In Him was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it. There came a man who was sent from God. His name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all men might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. See, John the Baptist's message was this. He said, I know you haven't heard from God for a while. I know that many of you are skeptical. I know that many of you don't even believe that there is a God. But God is about to do something that you don't want to miss. God is finally going to deal with your brokenness. God, you've been doing things for years to try to cover up your sin. God is about ready to do something to forgive your sin. Verse 9. The true light that gives light to every man was coming into the world. Every man? Every person? As in Abraham, all peoples will be blessed through you? Everyone? Verse 14. The Word became flesh and made His dwelling among us. We have seen His glory, the glory of the one and only who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. See, the next chapter in the story is called Grace. The law had told us the truth about ourselves and about our brokenness. And Jesus showed us grace. And Jesus said things to us that no one had ever said before. He told us how all along the way that God had given to us what we don't deserve, and yet He refused to give us what we do deserve. That instead of getting rid of the human race, when the human race broke everything, God instead made promises, and that was grace. When God gave the law, He gave a provision for people who would break the law, and that was grace. And Jesus showed us that throughout the whole story, God's grace had been there even though we didn't see it or understand it. And Jesus made it clear to us that it's not about the law of God, it's about the grace of God. He made it clear to us that God's story isn't about God paying us back, it's about God buying us back. And Jesus made it very clear to us that He wasn't just here for Israel. He was here for everybody. And before Jesus left this earth, He gathered His closest friends in an upper room. And He reminded them of the promises that God made a long time ago. The promises that God made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The promises that God made to Israel. And Jesus told them that on that day, God was making a new promise, a new covenant. But this promise was going to be different than the other promises. Jesus said this new covenant, this new promise was going to be made not only with words, but also with His body and with His blood. And Jesus went on to explain to them that when He dies, God promises to all mankind forgiveness forever for those who trust in Him. And He reminded them that God's promises aren't based on the actions of humanity. Instead, they're based on the character of God. And that God always keeps His promises. And in just a few hours after explaining this new covenant to His disciples in that upper room, the baby of Bethlehem was stretched out on a cross. And He died for your sin. And He died for my sin. And He died for all the sins that you and that I and that everyone in this world would ever commit. And God kept His promise to Abraham. And God kept His promise to you and to me. That all people have been blessed because of what God's own Son did for us. So that no one else's son, so that no one else's daughter would ever have to pay the price for their own sin. But that's not the final chapter in the story. See, the final chapter is called surrender. Because once you know the story, and maybe you've never understood it until now, but once you know the story, once you understand the story, what else can you do? Because this is God's story. But it's also the story of redemption, which means it's your story and mine. See, surrendering your life to an invisible God, it makes absolutely no sense until you understand the story. And now you do. Father, it's my prayer that as we hear the story that you have written, that you have woven together over thousands of years, that each one of us would be reminded, that we would be in awe of what you have actually done for us by sacrificing your Son for our sin. Father, I pray that for those people who are here today that maybe understand your story for the very first time, I pray that your Spirit would continue to work in their hearts and in their lives, telling them the truth about who you are, about your great love for them, and about the gift of forgiveness that your Son Jesus has given to them through His death. Father, each one of us doesn't have to think very long before we're reminded of our own brokenness, before we're reminded of our arguments and our battling with you over your rules, over your law, over the things that you've told us, over right and over wrong. And so, Father, hear us now as we confess before you our own sins,